Have you ever seen someone mock a homeless woman in public only to discover she was the property owner? The eviction notice was taped to my restaurant's front door when I arrived at 6 in the morning. I stood there in the October cold, coffee cup halfway to my mouth, reading the legal document 3 times because my brain refused to process what it said. Quote, the signature at the bottom belonged to someone named Margaret Holloway, and below it, in smaller print, Quote 1. My restaurant, the building I'd been renting for 18 months. I'd never heard that name before. My lease was with some management company called Prestige Property Group, and I'd been paying rent to them like clockwork every month. But there she was, Margaret Holloway, claiming to own my building and demanding I leave. The coffee in my hand had gone cold, and I realized my fingers were numb from gripping the cup too hard. This had to be a mistake, or a scam, or something, because the only Margaret I knew in connection with this building was the crazy homeless woman who'd been camping outside for the past 3 months. I'd been running the copper skillet for a year and a half when the homeless woman appeared. The restaurant was my dream, a farm-to-table breakfast and lunch spot in a gentrifying neighborhood that was just starting to attract young professionals and families with money to spend. I'd sunk every dollar I had into the lease, equipment, and renovations. The space had been a dumpy diner before I took it over, and I'd transformed it into something Instagram-worthy with exposed brick, reclaimed wood tables, and a menu that featured things like duck confit hash and lavender-infused French toast. Business was good. Not great yet, but building. I was finally starting to break even when Margaret showed up. She appeared one morning in September, dragging a shopping cart full of what looked like random junk, and set up camp on the bench directly in front of my restaurant. She was maybe 60, with gray hair matted into something between dreadlocks and a bird's nest, wearing layers of mismatched clothing despite the warm weather. She smelled badly, and she talked to herself in a constant stream of muttering that my customers could hear through the windows. The first week, I tried to be sympathetic. I brought her leftover pastries and coffee, asked if she needed help finding a shelter. She'd looked at me with these sharp blue eyes that seemed weirdly lucid despite the rest of her appearance and said, I'm exactly where I need to be, thank you. Then she went back to arranging items from her cart in careful patterns on the ground, bottle caps, pieces of string, what looked like old photographs sealed in plastic bags. I told myself she was harmless. Just another casualty of rising rents and inadequate mental health services in the city. I could be patient. Except she didn't leave. She stayed there, day after day, sleeping on that bench, spreading her belongings across the sidewalk, muttering and rearranging her strange collection, and my customers started complaining. One regular, a tech executive named Derek, who usually came in 3 times a week, pulled me aside and said, Quote 6, I tried calling the city. Non-emergency police line, homeless outreach services, the business improvement district. Everyone gave me the same answer. If she wasn't breaking any laws, there wasn't much they could do. Sitting on a public bench wasn't illegal. Neither was being homeless or looking crazy. I'd have to wait until she did something that violated municipal codes, blocking the sidewalk beyond a certain threshold, harassing pedestrians, creating a health hazard. I started documenting everything. Photos of her sprawled across the bench, her cart blocking part of the sidewalk, the accumulation of trash around her spot. I measured the space she was occupying, 63 inches of sidewalk obstruction at its worst. I logged complaints from customers, noting dates and times. I was building a case, being strategic about it. I called the property management company, Prestige Property Group, and spoke to a woman named Bethany who said she'd look into it. We'll send someone to assess the situation, she promised. That was in late September. By mid-October, no one had come, Margaret was still there, and I'd lost 3 regular customers who'd explicitly said they weren't coming back because of quote 8. That's when I started getting mean about it. I'm not proud of it, but desperation makes you ugly. I stopped bringing her food. I started spraying down the sidewalk every morning at 6, using the hose with enough pressure that water would splash near her, forcing her to move her stuff. I played music from the outdoor speakers, not loud enough to violate noise ordinances, but loud enough to be annoying if you were trying to sleep on a bench. I told my staff to ask her to move whenever she was blocking the entrance, which was basically always. My sous chef, a kid named Julian who was too nice for his own good, protested. Quote, 9. Quote, 10. I cut him off. Quote, 11. He shut up after that, but I could see the judgment in his eyes. The real trouble started on a Saturday morning in mid-October. Peak brunch rush, line out the door, every table full. Margaret was having one of her bad days, shouting at invisible people, waving her arms. Surrounded by her belongings spread across a 6-foot radius. A family with 2 young kids approached the entrance, saw her, and turned around. Just left. I watched it happen through the window, watched a $60 check walk away because of her. Something in me snapped. I stormed outside, and without thinking about who might be watching or recording, I started yelling. Quote, 12. Margaret looked up at me with those eerily calm blue eyes and said, quote, 13. I actually laughed. Quote, 14. Multiple people had their phones out. I noticed in my peripheral vision, but I was too angry to care. Margaret stood up slowly, and despite being maybe 5'4" to my 6'1", she somehow seemed to loom. Quote, 15. She said, her voice suddenly clear and sharp, none of the muttering confusion. Quote, 16. Before I could respond, she pulled something from one of her plastic bags, a laminated document. Quote, 17. The sidewalk tilted under my feet. I grabbed the document from her hand, and there it was. Official county recorder's office seal, property description matching my address, owner listed as Margaret A. Holloway. I stood there staring at the deed while Saturday morning shoppers and restaurant patrons moved around us. My mouth was open, but no sound was coming out. This couldn't be real. Property owners didn't camp outside their own buildings dressed like homeless people. They didn't mutter to themselves and collect bottle caps. They wore suits and had offices and accountants. Margaret, if that's who she really was, carefully took the deed back from my hand and returned it to its plastic bag. I'll be sending you formal notice of lease violations, she said. You have 30 days to vacate. If you contest the eviction, I'll see you in court with the video evidence from these nice people who've been filming your harassment. She gestured to the small crowd that had gathered, several of whom were indeed holding up phones. Then she sat back down on her bench, pulled a book from her cart, a hardcover book I noticed now, not magazine or newspaper, and started reading like nothing had happened. I walked back into my restaurant on legs that didn't feel connected to my body. The rest of that day was a blur. I tried to focus on the rush, on the orders and the customers, but my brain kept circling back to that laminated deed. Julian asked if I was okay. I lied. After the lunch rush died down, I locked myself in the office and started making calls. First to Prestige Property Group. Bethany answered, and I asked her directly. Quote, 22. She put me on hold for 5 minutes. When she came back, her voice was carefully neutral. Quote, 23. Quote, 24. Quote, 25. Quote, 26. A pause. Quote, 27. I hung up. Then I called my lawyer. Well, my cousin Brad, who was a lawyer, though his specialty was contract law for tech companies, not landlord-tenant disputes. Brad listened to my explanation, and I could hear him trying not to laugh. I protested. Brad was quiet for a moment. I'd been asking myself the same question. Maybe she's mentally ill, or it's some kind of performance art thing, or she's testing me. Testing you for what? Being an asshole to homeless people? Because if so, you failed. Brad wasn't helping. Quote, 34. Brad sighed. Quote, 35. I sent Brad the lease agreement and spent the rest of the evening Googling Margaret Holloway. What I found made everything worse. She was legitimate, more than legitimate. Margaret Ann Holloway, age 63, one of the largest private commercial property owners in the city. Articles from 15 years ago in the Business Journal profiling her as a, quote, 36 who'd built an empire of neighborhood retail properties. An interview from 2008 where she talked about her investment philosophy. I believe in buying in neighborhoods before they're discovered and holding long-term. I'm not interested in flipping or maximum profit extraction. I want stable, sustainable growth. The articles described her as eccentric, intensely private, and brilliant at identifying emerging markets. The most recent article I could find was from 5 years ago, a brief mention in a piece about property ownership in gentrifying neighborhoods. No photos except one grainy headshot from a 1995 award ceremony, But the woman in that photo could have been the woman on the bench. Hard to tell with 30 years and massive style differences between them. I didn't sleep that night. I kept running through scenarios, trying to figure out what Margaret's angle was. Why camp outside her own building? Why not just introduce herself as the owner from the beginning? Why let me harass her for months before revealing the truth? The only conclusion I could reach was that she'd been testing me, observing how I treated someone I perceived as powerless. And I'd failed spectacularly. Every cruel thing I'd done, the water spray, the loud music, the yelling, it all replayed in my head with new context. I hadn't just been mean to a homeless woman. I'd been mean to the person who controlled whether my business could exist. At 3 a.m, I pulled up the lease agreement and found the clause Brad had probably already identified. Quote, 38 violation of this clause constituted grounds for immediate lease termination. I was screwed. Brad called the next morning, Sunday, which told me how serious this was. Lawyers don't work Sundays unless something's catastrophically wrong. Quote 39. He said, quote 40, quote 41, quote 40. I asked Brad what he thought I should do. Quote 43. Monday morning, I arrived at the restaurant at 5:30, before Margaret usually showed up. Except she was already there, sitting on the bench with a thermos of what smelled like coffee and that hardcover book. I approached slowly, hands visible, trying to look non-threatening. Quote 44. She looked up, her expression neutral. Quote 45, quote 46. I took a breath. Quote 47. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, studying my face. Quote 48, she finally asked. I shook my head. Margaret gestured for me to sit on the bench, not next to her, but on the other end. I sat. Quote 49, she paused. Quote 50. My stomach dropped. Quote 51. Margaret nodded. Quote 52. I asked her what I could possibly say to change her mind. Quote 53, she said simply. Quote 54. She pulled out a folder from her cart, and I realized now that her cart wasn't full of junk, but carefully organized documents in plastic sleeves. These are photos and videos documenting your harassment, dates, times, witnesses. This is a written testimony from your employee, Julian, who contacted my office last week to report your behavior. He was worried about you and about what you were doing to me. That young man has more integrity in his little finger than you've shown in 18 months. She handed me a formal eviction notice. You have 30 days. I suggest you spend that time thinking about what kind of person you want to be. I walked into my restaurant feeling like I'd been gutted. Julian was already there, prepping for the breakfast service. When he saw my face, he knew. It wasn't a question. You contacted her office? I asked. Julian met my eyes without flinching. Someone had to. What you were doing wasn't right, boss. I tried to tell you, but you wouldn't listen. So yeah, I found out who the property owner was. Took some digging, but I found it, and I sent them an email. Told them what was happening. Included photos. He crossed his arms. I thought maybe if the real owner knew, they'd step in. I didn't know the real owner was the woman you were harassing. I should have fired him. I had every right to fire him for going around me, for reporting me to the landlord. But I couldn't. Because he'd been right. I'm losing the lease, I told him. 30 days to vacate. Start looking for new jobs. I'm sorry I dragged you into this. The next week was a nightmare of logistics and damage control. I had to notify my staff, figure out what to do with equipment, start looking for a new location, even though I knew I couldn't afford deposits and moving costs on top of existing debt. Word spread fast in the neighborhood business community. Other restaurant owners, retail shops, the coffee place 2 doors down. Everyone knew the Copper Skillet was closing because the owner had harassed his landlord. Some people were sympathetic in a schadenfreude way. Others just avoided me. A reporter from the local neighborhood blog reached out asking for comment on, quote, 63, quote, I declined to comment. They ran the story anyway. The article included quotes from witnesses who'd seen my Saturday morning meltdown, along with background on Margaret's reputation as an eccentric but fair property owner who valued character over profit. The comments section was brutal. Quote, 65, quote, 66, quote, 67. The story got picked up by larger outlets, local news stations, then a few national websites that cover urban development issues. Suddenly, I was the face of everything wrong with gentrification. the entitled newcomer who treated vulnerable people with contempt until it affected his bottom line. My Instagram and Yelp pages were flooded with one-star reviews from people who'd never even been to my restaurant. Owner harasses homeless people. Do not support this business. Hope he loses everything. The restaurant was empty. Nobody wanted to be associated with the place. The few loyal customers who showed up looked uncomfortable, apologetic. My investors, 2 friends from college who'd put in $15,000 each, called demanding to know what the hell was going on and whether they'd see any of their money back. I didn't have good answers. Brad started exploring bankruptcy options. My parents called, my mother crying, asking how I could have done something so cruel. Everyone wanted explanations, wanted me to justify myself, wanted some indication that I wasn't actually a terrible person. I had nothing. Julian quit on day 12, walked into my office and put his chef's coat on my desk. I tried to protest, but he cut me off. He paused at the door. Quote 73. He left. I sat in my office surrounded by unpaid invoices and negative reviews and thought about how I'd managed to destroy everything I'd built in 18 months through a combination of cruelty and stupidity. Day 15, I received a letter from Margaret's attorney. I recognized the law firm, Kaplan and Associates, one of the most prestigious real estate law practices in the city. The attorney's name was Daniel Kaplan, founding partner, 30 years practicing property law. The letter was formal and cold. I read the letter 4 times. The insurance had lapsed. I'd missed the renewal payment during the chaos. The waste violations were technical, barely worth mentioning normally. The fire code thing was a grease trap that needed replacing, something I'd been putting off. None of it would have mattered if Margaret wanted to keep me as a tenant. But she didn't, so now every minor violation was being weaponized. Brad reviewed the demand letter and confirmed what I already knew. It was all legitimate. She's not being vindictive, he explained. She's being thorough. Everything in this letter is documented, accurate, and legally actionable. If you'd been a good tenant in other ways, she probably would have let this stuff slide or given you time to fix it. But you're not a good tenant, so she's holding you to every letter of the lease. He paused. Justin, you need to pay this. Don't fight it. Don't try to negotiate. Just pay it and end this as cleanly as possible, because if this goes to court, it's going to get worse. She'll bring up the harassment. There'll be testimony. Videos will be entered into evidence. It'll be in the public record forever. Every future landlord will see it. Every future business partner. Pay the money and move on. I didn't have $18,000. I barely had rent money for my apartment. The restaurant had been operating on razor-thin margins even before the eviction. I'd have to borrow from my parents, who'd already loaned me $40,000 for the initial build-out. I'd have to admit, complete failure. Day 20, the restaurant closed permanently. I couldn't justify staying open for the final 10 days when we were averaging 6 customers a day. I had a going-out-of-business sale for the equipment, sold everything to other restaurant owners at pennies on the dollar. The Viking range I'd paid $8,000 for went for $1,200. The custom-built tables I'd commissioned from a local woodworker sold for less than the cost of materials. I kept hoping Margaret would show up, maybe having reconsidered, maybe willing to give me another chance. She didn't. She stayed on her bench for those 3 weeks, reading her books, occasionally arranging her items in those strange patterns, completely ignoring the drama happening 6 feet away. Other business owners on the block would stop and chat with her now. I'd see them sitting on her bench, laughing, bringing her real food instead of leftovers. She was friendly with them, animated, clearly not the confused homeless person she'd pretended to be with me. They all knew the story. Some of them made a point of ignoring me when I walked past. On the final day, I did one last walkthrough of the empty restaurant space. It had been beautiful once, before I'd filled it with my own ugliness. The exposed brick was still there, the custom light fixtures, the carefully selected paint colors. All the bones of something good, stripped of everything that had made it mine. I thought about the version of myself who'd signed the lease 18 months ago, so full of optimism and plans, that Justin wouldn't recognize who I'd become. Or maybe he would. Maybe the seeds of this failure had been there all along. The arrogance, the belief that business success justified cruelty, the inability to see people as human when they couldn't do anything for me. I locked the door for the last time and left the keys in the drop box per the lease terms. Margaret was on her bench. I walked past without looking at her, and I heard her voice, quote, 78. I stopped, but didn't turn around. Some advice for wherever you end up next. Character isn't what you do when people are watching. It's what you do when you think no one important is. I moved back in with my parents at age 35, a level of failure I'd never imagined possible. The debt was crushing. $40,000 to my parents for the original investment, $18,000 to Margaret for the repairs and violations, another $12,000 in various outstanding bills from vendors and suppliers. I'd destroyed my credit, my reputation, and my relationship with everyone who'd believed in me. My mom tried to be supportive, but I could see the disappointment in her eyes. My dad was less subtle. I got a job at a corporate chain restaurant as a line cook, the kind of place I'd sworn I'd never work at again after culinary school. The pay was half what I'd made at my own place, and the work was mindless, but I needed the income. My coworkers were mostly kids in their 20s, and they treated me with casual indifference that was somehow worse than hostility. I was the old guy who'd failed at the dream they were all chasing. 6 months after the eviction, I was walking through the old neighborhood and couldn't resist going past the former restaurant location. I told myself I was just curious about what business had taken over the space. What I found stopped me cold. The space was completely different. Walls had been knocked down, connecting my former restaurant to the unit next door. The new business was a community center and affordable co-working space called Westwood Commons. The signage explained it was a non-profit providing resources for neighborhood residents, including job training, small business mentoring, and community meeting space. Through the windows, I could see people working at shared tables, a small cafe area serving coffee, what looked like a class or workshop happening in the back. The space was full, bustling, alive in a way my restaurant had never been. A small plaque near the door read, Westwood Commons, founded by Holloway Properties LLC in partnership with Neighborhood Forward Initiative, providing community resources for sustainable neighborhood development. Margaret had turned my failure into something that actually helped people. I stood there for maybe 15 minutes, watching through the windows. At one point, I saw Julian, my former sous chef, working at one of the communal tables, talking animatedly with someone over coffee. He looked happy. He didn't see me. I walked away feeling something I couldn't quite name. Not quite jealousy, not quite regret. Maybe recognition that the space had found its proper purpose, and I'd just been keeping it from that purpose for 18 months. Margaret had been right about everything. I'd thought I was bringing something valuable to the neighborhood. Good food, jobs, a gathering place. But I'd really just brought my own ambition and my willingness to step on people to achieve it. The neighborhood didn't need more of that. It needed what was there now, space for people to gather, resources for people to build their own dreams, a commitment to the community that went deeper than profit margins. I'd been playing at entrepreneurship without understanding what it meant to actually serve people. The bankruptcy proceedings took 8 months. Brad handled it for me, navigating the complex documentation and court appearances. We filed Chapter 7, which meant most of my business debts would be discharged, but my personal debts, the money I owed my parents, the settlement with Margaret, those remained. Quote, 83. Brad told me after the final hearing. Quote, 84. He wasn't being cruel, just realistic. The question is, what are you going to do with that? I didn't have an answer. I'd been so focused on surviving day to day that I hadn't thought about the future. The idea of opening another restaurant someday felt laughable. The idea of working in hospitality at all felt exhausting. I'd lost the passion somewhere between the eviction and the bankruptcy. A year after the eviction, I was still living with my parents and working at the chain restaurant. I'd paid down some of the debt, a few $100s a month to my parents, token payments to Margaret's attorney. I'd deleted all my social media accounts after the harassment got too intense. I existed in a kind of limbo, not moving forward, but not drowning either. Then I got an email from an address I didn't recognize, margaret.holloway@hollowayproperties.com. The subject line was, Opportunity. My first instinct was to delete it, assuming it was more legal threats or a demand for faster payment, but curiosity won. The email was brief. Mr. Collins, I have a position available at Westwood Commons that might interest you. Kitchen manager for the cafe, plus teaching responsibilities for our culinary job training program. $45,000 annual salary plus benefits. If you're interested, We can discuss whether you've learned enough to be worth a second chance. MH. I read it 5 times, certain I was misunderstanding something. I called Brad immediately. Is this a trap? Is she trying to get more money out of me? Brad laughed, actually laughed. Justin, she doesn't need to trap you. She could garnish your wages directly if she wanted to accelerate payment. If she's offering you a job, it's because she thinks you might have something to contribute. The question is, have you? Had I learned anything? I'd spent a year working a mindless job, paying down debt, living in my childhood bedroom, thinking about what I'd destroyed. I'd watched my former space become something meaningful. I'd sat with the knowledge that I'd treated another human being with cruelty because I thought I could get away with it. I'd lost everything because of my own character failures. If that wasn't enough to change someone, what would be? I told Brad. He advised me to respond carefully, professionally, with humility. Quote 92. I responded to Margaret's email that night. Ms. Holloway, I would be honored to discuss this opportunity. I understand that I have no right to expect second chances, and I'm grateful you're willing to consider one. I've spent the past year thinking about my failures and trying to become someone different. I can't undo what I did, but I can commit to being better. If you're willing to meet, I'm available at your convenience. Justin Collins. Her response came the next morning. Thursday, 10 a.m., Westwood Commons. Don't be late, MH. The 3 days before that meeting were torture. I rehearsed what I'd say, imagined every way the conversation could go wrong, second-guessed whether this was real or some elaborate final humiliation. Thursday morning, I arrived at Westwood Commons 15 minutes early. The space was even more impressive inside, bright and welcoming, with that community energy that good spaces have. Margaret was waiting in a small office off the main area. She looked completely different from the woman on the bench, clean, professional, wearing simple but expensive-looking clothing, her gray hair cut into a neat bob. She gestured for me to sit. Margaret began. She pulled out a folder, similar to the one she'd had in her cart a year ago. I've been following your situation since the eviction. I know you filed bankruptcy. I know you're working at a chain place. I know you deleted your social media after getting harassed. I also know you've been making consistent payments on your debt to me, despite barely being able to afford it. And I know from your former employee, Julian, who now works with our job training program, that you've apparently been doing some genuine soul-searching. She leaned forward. So tell me, what have you learned? I took a breath. This was it. The moment where I either proved I'd changed or proved I was still the same person who'd harassed a homeless woman. I learned that I'm someone who becomes cruel when I'm scared. I learned that I valued success more than humanity. I learned that I'd built my whole identity around being a successful restaurant owner, and when that was threatened, I was willing to hurt people to protect it. I paused. I learned that who you are when things are hard matters more than who you are when things are easy, and I learned that I didn't like who I was when things were hard. The past year has been about trying to figure out who I want to be instead. Margaret was quiet, watching me with those sharp blue eyes that had seen through me from the beginning. And who do you want to be? Someone who treats people with dignity regardless of what they can do for me. Someone who contributes to community instead of just extracting from it. Someone who, when faced with another crisis, makes different choices. Margaret nodded slowly. Here's what this job would be. You'd manage our cafe kitchen, which serves about 200 people a day. You'd teach culinary skills classes to people who are unemployed or underemployed. You'd work with people experiencing homelessness, people with criminal records, people with mental health challenges, all the people you'd probably rather not deal with. You'd be doing it for less money than you made at your own place, with none of the glory or creative control. And you'd be doing it under my supervision, which means I'll be watching for any sign that you're reverting to who you were. She leaned back. I'm offering you this because I believe in second chances, but also because I believe in consequences. This job is both. It's a chance to rebuild your career and your character, but it's also a consequence. You'll be serving the exact community you dismissed. You'll be face-to-face with your own prejudices every single day. If you can handle that, you might actually become someone worth being. I took the job. The first 3 months were humbling in ways I couldn't have anticipated. I was used to being the boss, making decisions, having authority. Now I was an employee, following Margaret's vision, teaching people who'd experienced levels of hardship I'd never imagined. One of my students, a woman named Patricia, had been homeless for 6 years before finding housing through one of Margaret's properties. Another student, Robert, had a criminal record and couldn't get hired anywhere, despite being a talented cook. A third, Amanda, was dealing with severe anxiety that made traditional employment nearly impossible. They were all difficult to work with in different ways. Patricia was unreliable with timing. Robert was defensive about criticism. Amanda needed constant reassurance. My old self would have given up on them, complained about their limitations, focused on efficiency over empathy. My new self, the self I was trying to build, had to learn patience. Had to learn that people aren't just employees or obstacles. They're individuals with complex histories and valid struggles. Julian was there, which made everything both easier and harder. He was running the job training program with a grant from some nonprofit, and he was good at it, patient, encouraging, believing in people's potential, even when they didn't believe in themselves. He was friendly but distant with me, professional but not warm. One day, about 2 months in, I asked him directly, "Are we ever going to be okay?" He thought about it. "Honestly, I don't know. I see you trying, and that matters. But you hurt me too, Justin. Not just Margaret, not just the way you treated her. You hurt me by making me complicit in something I thought was wrong, by dismissing my concerns, by treating my morals like they were naive. I needed this job back then, so I stayed. But I lost respect for you, and respect is hard to rebuild." He paused. "Keep doing what you're doing. Keep showing up. Keep being patient with the students. Keep being humble. Eventually, maybe I'll trust you again. But it's not happening just because you got knocked down and learned your lesson. It's happening if you prove you've actually changed." Margaret was everywhere all the time. She'd show up at random times, observe classes, talk to students, check in with me about how things were going. She was demanding, but fair, calling out mistakes immediately, but also acknowledging good work. She treated everyone the same, students, staff, contractors, visitors, with this baseline dignity that I'd never really understood before. One afternoon, about 4 months into the job, she pulled me aside after I'd handled a difficult situation with Robert, who'd gotten angry during a critique and stormed out. I'd followed him, talked him down, gotten him to come back and finish the class. Margaret had watched the whole thing. Quote, 108. She said. Quote, 109. It was the first real compliment she'd given me. I didn't realize how much I'd needed it until I felt my throat tighten. "I'm trying," I said. She nodded. "I know. Keep trying." The first time I worked directly with someone experiencing homelessness was 6 months into the job. His name was Leon, maybe 30 years old, living in a shelter after losing his housing. He'd been a prep cook at a hotel before a series of bad breaks left him on the streets. He signed up for our culinary program, hoping to get back into the industry. The first day he showed up, I saw myself in the kitchen a year earlier, looking at Margaret on the bench, seeing only the surface, making assumptions. Except now I was on the other side. Leon was nervous, apologetic about his appearance, clearly expecting to be judged or dismissed. I thought about what Margaret had said. Character is what you do when you think no one important is watching. Except everyone is important. Every person deserves dignity. I shook Leon's hand, welcomed him to the class, and treated him exactly like I treated everyone else. Over the next 8 weeks, I watched him transform, confidence building, skills sharpening, hope returning. He got a job at a downtown restaurant because of skills he'd learned in our program. At his graduation, he thanked me publicly, said I'd changed his life. I thought about how close I'd come to never being in a position to help anyone, and the gratitude felt unearned but necessary. A year into the job, Margaret called me into her office. Quote 112, she said. Quote 113. I stared at her, stunned. Quote 114. Margaret smiled slightly. Quote 115. She paused. Quote 116. I took the promotion. The new community center opened 6 months later, and it was chaos in the best way. More students, bigger kitchen, partnerships with local schools and job programs. I hired 2 former students from our original program, including Patricia, who'd gotten her life stabilized and turned out to be an incredible prep cook. We served 400 meals a day, ran 3 training sessions a week, and became a real anchor for the neighborhood. Local news did a story about the opening, and they interviewed me as part of it. The reporter asked about my background, whether I'd always been in community work. I could have lied, could have avoided mentioning the restaurant and the eviction. Instead, I told the truth. I said. The reporter looked shocked but kept rolling. That night, the story aired, and my phone exploded with messages. Some supportive, some angry, all intense. The unexpected outcome was that the story resonated. People loved the redemption arc, the idea that someone could genuinely change. I started getting speaking requests, community organizations, business groups, even a culinary school wanting me to talk to students about ethics and failure. I was uncomfortable with the attention at first, worried I was profiting from my own bad behavior. Margaret advised me to accept the opportunities. Quote, 119, she said. Quote, 120. So I started speaking, telling the full story, the harassment, the eviction, the bankruptcy, the slow rebuilding. The response was overwhelming. People came up afterward with their own stories of failure and redemption, of learning hard lessons, of trying to be better. I realized that sharing my worst moment was somehow more valuable than sharing any success I'd ever had. 3 years after the eviction, I was managing 3 community center food programs across the city. I'd promoted several former students into staff positions, maintained relationships with dozens of program graduates, and helped secure funding for expanded operations. I was making a comfortable salary, not restaurant owner money, but enough to live independently and continue paying down my remaining debts. My parents were proud of me in a way they'd never been when I had my own place. My father told me once, "I'm prouder of who you are now than who you were trying to be then. You're actually making a difference instead of just making money." I'd reconnected with some old friends who'd cut me off after the scandal, though those relationships were different now, less superficial, more honest. I was dating someone, a social worker named Nicole, who worked with housing insecure populations. She knew my whole story and chose to be with me anyway, which felt like its own form of redemption. Margaret and I had lunch once a month, a standing appointment she'd initiated after the first year. We'd talk about the programs, about challenges and successes, but also about broader things, neighborhood development, economic justice, the ethics of wealth and power. She told me stories about her own early years, mistakes she'd made, hard lessons she'd learned. "I wasn't always this person," she said during one lunch. "When I was younger, I was ruthless. I bought properties and evicted people without thinking about consequences. I made money, but lost my humanity. It took some painful losses, people I cared about leaving me, realizing I was isolated and unhappy, to change. The camping test, the focus on character over profit, all of that came from recognizing that I'd been doing everything wrong." She smiled. "We're both people who had to fail spectacularly to learn who we wanted to be. The difference is, you learned faster than I did. You're rebuilding in your 30s. I didn't start really changing until my 50s. You're ahead of the game." Last month, Julian and I had coffee for the first time in a social context rather than a work one. 3 years had passed since the eviction, and our relationship had slowly thawed from professional tolerance to genuine respect to something approaching friendship. Over coffee, he told me something I'd never known. Margaret had approached him the week after my Saturday morning meltdown. She'd seen his discomfort with my behavior, his quiet attempts to push back, his eventual decision to report me. She'd offered him a job running the culinary training program before she'd even finalized my eviction. "She told me she was impressed by my integrity," Julian said. "She said most people stay silent when they see wrong being done, especially when it might cost them something. The fact that I was willing to risk my job to report you meant I was someone worth investing in." He paused. "I've thought a lot about that, about how your worst moment created my biggest opportunity. Life is weird like that." The restaurant space, my former restaurant space, is still the Westwood Commons Community Center. I go there regularly for meetings and collaborative programs. Every time I walk through that door, I remember what it used to be, what I wanted it to be, what it actually became. The transformation is a physical reminder of the core truth I'd learned. My vision for that space was small and self-serving. Margaret's vision was expansive and community-focused. I'd wanted to build something that glorified me. She built something that served others. The difference between those two approaches is the difference between success and meaning. I have meaning now in ways I never had when I was chasing success. The work I do matters to people. The students I teach remember me. The meals we serve feed people who need them. It's not glamorous or Instagram-worthy, but it's real. It's grounded in actual human need rather than my own ego. And somehow that's more satisfying than any Michelin star would have been. Margaret called me 2 weeks ago with unexpected news. She's stepping back from day-to-day operations of Holloway Properties, transitioning to an advisory role while younger staff take over management. "I'm 66, she said. "I've spent 40 years building this, and it's time to let other people carry it forward. But I want you to consider something. We're restructuring the community programs as a separate nonprofit entity. We need an executive director, someone who understands both the operational side and the mission side, someone who's failed and rebuilt and knows what that takes. I'm offering you the position." I was stunned. Executive director meant overseeing all the programs, managing a staff of 30, working with funders and community partners, making strategic decisions about expansion and development. It was a level of responsibility and trust I'd never imagined having again. I asked. Margaret said simply, "I accepted the position last week. The transition will take a few months, but by next year, I'll be leading an organization that serves thousands of people across multiple neighborhoods. It's terrifying and humbling and feels like more responsibility than I deserve. But Margaret's right. I'm ready. I'm not the same person who harassed a homeless woman because she was inconvenient. I'm not the person who valued profit over humanity. I'm someone who learned the hardest way possible that character matters more than success, that how you treat the powerless defines who you really are, and that second chances are precious gifts that must be earned and protected." The old Justin died in that moment when Margaret revealed who she was. The person I am now was built from those ruins, slowly and painfully, under the watch of someone who believed change was possible, even when I didn't believe it myself. That's the story I'll keep telling, not to excuse what I did, but to show what's possible when you face your worst self and choose to become someone better. Every day, I walk past businesses in the neighborhoods where I work. Some of them are like my old restaurant, shiny and ambitious, catering to newcomers with money, sometimes dismissive of longtime residents or people experiencing hardship. I see myself in those owners, the combination of hope and arrogance that comes with believing you're bringing something valuable when you're really just bringing your own agenda. I want to tell them what I learned, warn them about the tests they don't know they're taking, explain that the person sleeping on the bench outside might be the one determining their future. But nobody learns these lessons secondhand. You have to fail. You have to face consequences. You have to rebuild. All I can do is be available when they fail, ready to offer the same second chance I received, hoping they're capable of the same transformation. Because that's what Margaret taught me, ultimately. People can change if they're willing to do the work, and the work of changing is the most important work anyone ever does. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.